January 1946. Bombay Harbour. A grey troopship slid past anchored freighters and fishing boats, its decks crowded with men in khaki leaning over railings, staring at a city that shimmered in heat and coal smoke. One of them, a 28-year-old sergeant in the British Army, gripped his kit bag and a battered notebook. In later accounts, he would be called only Sergeant Thomas H. He had fought in North Africa and Burma. He had seen Rommel's tanks, Japanese bayonets, malaria wards. He had not expected, after Hitler and Hirohito, to be sent to police people who were officially British subjects. On paper, his mission was simple: maintain order, guard key installations, support the civil government of British India until constitutional arrangements were agreed. In training depots back home, officers had briefed him in the language of empire. India was the jewel in the crown. Its people respected firmness. Congress leaders and Muslim League leaders were reasonable men with whom His Majesty's government would negotiate. The mathematics of British rule seemed reassuringly simple. 70,000 white soldiers, nearly 2 million Indian troops still nominally under British command, a civil service steeped in habits of obedience. Against that, a handful of nationalist politicians, some student agitators, a scattered underground of revolutionaries, a minor assignment compared to the Wehrmacht or the Imperial Japanese Army. He would soon learn that this arithmetic was wrong in every significant way. Empires are not lost when enemies break their lines. They are lost when the ruled decide, en masse, not to cooperate. The first cracks a navy that refused orders. February 18, 1946. Barely weeks after Thomas's arrival, news crackled through the barracks in Bombay. Indian ratings. Enlisted sailors on the HMIS Talwar had walked off duty. At first, it sounded like a routine discipline matter. Bad food, racial insults from British petty officers, low pay. But within days, the protests spread to ships and shore establishments across Bombay, Karachi, Calcutta. Flags other than the Union Jack appeared on masts. The tricolour of the Congress, the green flag of the Muslim League, the red flag of the left. It was not yet a disciplined political revolution. It was something more dangerous for an empire than a clear enemy. A mass of young men in uniform realizing, almost simultaneously, that they could say no. From his post guarding a dock warehouse, Thomas watched Indian sailors march in formation through the streets, armed only with iron bars and anything they could seize. Crowds cheered them. Some British officers panicked, ordering tanks into position. Others hesitated. Fire on your own navy? The official reports called it the Royal Indian Navy Mutiny. Mutinies, Munden minimized it as a storm in a teacup. To a British sergeant on the ground, it felt like a test. The numbers were stark: 78 ships, over 20 shore establishments. Roughly 20,000 ratings involved at peak. If it had been a German division, he knew what to do. Artillery, infantry, clear orders. Here, the enemy wore the same king, and they were cheered by civilians whose allegiance he was supposed to protect. In the end, political leaders from Congress and the Muslim League told the mutineers to stand down. They did. But inside the mess halls, British NCOs read the situation clearly. If command of the sea could wobble, what about the loyalty of the army? What if the next order refused was to load rifles, not mess tins? Trials that turned traitors into heroes. During those same months, another drama played out in the Red Fort in Delhi. Trials of officers from the Indian National Army, INA UNA men who had taken up arms alongside the Japanese during the war. In Burma, Thomas had heard of them as traitors. They had fought under Subhas Chandra Bose, switching sides after capture, wearing uniforms supplied by Tokyo. In British briefing papers, they were a footnote, some discontented POWs, militarily insignificant, to be punished after victory. Yet as the trials began in late 1945, crowds gathered outside the Red Fort daily. Posters with the accused officers' faces appeared on walls. Lawyers from Congress defended them in court. Pamphlets circulated calling them patriots. To British legal officers, the case was straightforward. Did you take the King's commission? Yes. Did you then fight under the enemy's flag? Also yes. By any standard military code, the death sentence followed. But politically, the situation inverted. The more zeal British prosecutors showed, the more the public rallied around the defendants. Rumours spread among Indian troops, the INA men are being hanged for trying to free us. In canteens and barracks, Thomas overheard sepoys asking quietly, "What will we do if ordered to fire on our own?" The imperial narrative loyal Indian soldiery commanded by British officers had held firm through 2 world wars. Now, in the very capital of the Raj, men who had broken that covenant stood in the dock while crowds chanted their names. London reduced sentences, commuted death penalties, sidestepped the full force of the law. It was a tactical retreat disguised as mercy. In his notebook, Thomas wrote that winter, "If traitors draw larger crowds than the Viceroy, we are not ruling. We are only lingering. The Empire's new enemy, arithmetic at home." Back in Britain, the war bill was coming due. The Treasury was bled white. Cities still lay in ruins. Demobilized soldiers wanted jobs, not new deployments, east of Suez. Clement Attlee's Labour government, elected in July 1945, promised welfare, housing, the National Health Service. India, once portrayed as the engine of imperial wealth, now looked like a drain, long supply lines, massive garrisons, constant political crises. Documents in London spoke of orderly transition, dominion status, negotiated settlement. On the ground in Calcutta, Bombay, Lahore, those phrases translated to something more blunt for British soldiers: hold the line while politicians figure out how to get us out. Orders came down with familiar firmness: protect key rail junctions, guard arsenals. Be ready to intervene in communal disturbances if civil police are overwhelmed. But the subtext had changed. This was not about holding an empire for the next century. It was about maintaining enough authority to exit without total chaos, or at least with chaos that could be blamed on someone else. In mess conversations, Thomas heard older NCO's voice, what officers did not. "We're not here to win anything. We're here to keep the lid on the pot until Whitehall says time." He had faced Japanese banzai charges in Burma, men who ran into machine gun fire shouting for their emperor. Now he faced crowds who carried no weapons, only placards, and the knowledge that London's appetite for bloodshed was gone. You can shell an enemy hill. Can you shell a march of 50,000 in your own empire's biggest city with American journalists watching? Theoretically, yes. Practically no government that had just fought fascism in Europe wanted pathé newsreels of British tanks firing on a Congress procession. The gap between theoretical power and usable power widened daily. Calcutta, victory parades turned charnel house. August 1946. Muslim League leader Muhammad Ali Jinnah called for Direct Action Day to press for Pakistan, a separate Muslim nation carved out of India. Congress leaders denounced the call. Viceroy Wavell worried privately about serious disturbances. On paper, British security forces had overwhelming advantage: regular troops, Indian Army units with British officers, police. In reality, communal tensions had been building for years, sharpened by economic strain and political deadlock. In Calcutta, the day exploded into violence. Processions turned into mobs. Slogans became war cries. Hindus and Muslims attacked each other in the streets with knives, sticks, whatever came to hand. Arson spread. Bodies multiplied faster than reports could be filed. From his post near a railway yard, Thomas watched columns of smoke rise across the city, not from enemy shells, but from homes and shops torched by neighbors. Orders crackled over radio: support civil power, maintain neutrality between communities, use minimum force necessary. But minimum force against thousands of men swept up in rage is a phrase better suited to dispatches than allies. When British troops moved into riot areas, they found streets slick with blood, children crying over corpses, men screaming prayers as they swung machetes. They opened fire when they had to. Sometimes they hesitated. Who was the enemy here? The one with the knife or the one with the broken skull? The numbers from Calcutta's riots were brutal. Over 4,000 dead by official counts. Tens of thousands injured or displaced. The city, described in imperial dispatches as the second city of the empire, had become a preview of what partition would look like 1 year early. For Thomas, the lesson was stark. We have guns and discipline and air support, but these people have something we don't understand. Hatreds older than our rule, sharpened by our divide and rule policies. We can drive a patrol through a street. We cannot occupy every doorway tied to a memory. An empire that had justified itself as bringer of order now stood in the middle of a slaughter. It could neither fully stop nor honestly disown. The daily grind of a dying Raj. Between headline crises, life for a British NCO in India was monotonous and surreal. Guard duty in heat that melted boot soles. Train escorts along lines that carried more rumours than coal. Barracks lectures about maintaining impartiality between communities from officers who rarely left cantonments. Thomas noted the contrasts that made a mockery of imperial rhetoric. In the officers' club, gin, billiards, talk of polo and postings. On the streets outside, rice queues. Inflation, newspapers with front-page photos of Gandhi on hunger strike, Nehru addressing crowds, Jinnah seated beneath maps. Once, during a market patrol, an elderly Indian man approached him, speaking in accented English, learned under some previous sahib. "You will go soon," the man said. "We know. You know. Why stay so long?" The sergeant had no answer. Orders were orders. The man shrugged. "We were told. The British are practical," he said. Practical men do not cling to a house that is already sold. For soldiers, the house still looked solid, flags still flew, marching bands still played on ceremonial days. Yet beneath the parades, the foundations had cracked. Indian politicians refused to join All India cabinets without real power. British soldiers no longer believed they were on a civilizing mission. British voters back home showed no appetite for a long counter-insurgency. Empires die not in a single act, but in a series of small decisions where each side chooses not to test the extreme limits of force. Orders that concealed surrender. June 1947. Word filtered through that a new viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, had arrived with unusual speed and an even more unusual brief. Transfer power quickly. Partition if necessary. The timetable moved from years to months. Maps were redrawn in air-conditioned rooms by men who had never walked the lanes. Their lines would divide. Punjab, Bengal, provinces where Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs had lived intertwined for generations, became subjects of negotiation. Thomas read a summary notice on the barracks bulletin board. His Majesty's government has decided to transfer power to responsible Indian hands not later than June 1948. Within weeks, that date shifted to August 1947. For a professional soldier, dates were not abstractions. They were planning horizons, convoys, withdrawals, handovers of arsenals. He realized that the empire, which had taken over a century to build, would, administratively, leave within roughly 14 months from decision to flag lowering. From London's perspective, this was efficient. From the perspective of the people who would live with its consequences, it was something else entirely. Secretly, many British officers were relieved. They had seen Calcutta, the naval mutiny, the INA trials. They did not want to be remembered as the men who ordered mass machine gunning of crowds to prolong a doomed rule. But relief sat uneasily alongside something like grief. Sergeants like Thomas had grown up on maps filled with red. Schoolroom globes had taught them that their small island ruled continents. Now, in mess halls, those same maps became embarrassments, relics to be taken down quietly. In his notebook, he wrote, "At Alamein and Imphal, defeat would have meant our cities burned. Here in India, defeat means we change trains and uniforms and someone else salutes at the station. The stakes for us are comfort, pride. For them, it is life, death, border, home. Partition, a line drawn in London, paid in blood on the ground. As summer 1947 approached, communal tension that had flared in Calcutta now ignited across the subcontinent. Rumours and hard facts mixed, provinces sliced in two. Districts awarded to one dominion or the other based on hurried census data. Whole villages suddenly discovering they were on the wrong side of a new border. Hindus and Sikhs fled from what was to become Pakistan. Muslims fled from what would be India. Columns of refugees stretched for miles, ox carts piled high with bedding, old people carried on shoulders, children walking until their feet bled. Bands of killers followed, on both sides. Trains arrived at stations not full of families but stacked with corpses. British soldiers had fought through the Somme, Dunkirk, Kohima. They had seen massacres, but these were enemies and allies, uniforms and fronts. Here, there was no front. The war was everywhere and nowhere. Thomas's unit was deployed to escort refugee convoys in Punjab. Their orders were chillingly limited. Protect convoys where possible. Do not become engaged in civil disputes beyond capability. Use force only as last resort. In practice, this meant firing warning shots at mobs, firing real shots when warnings failed, arriving too late, too often. He saw Sikh villages hacked apart by Muslim mobs. He saw Muslim caravans burned in reprisal. He saw British officers negotiating desperately with local leaders to open roads for a few hours so columns could pass. The empire that had prided itself on keeping the peace now served as a thin, overstretched buffer between communities unleashed. The arithmetic of manpower, once a British strength, now failed. Tens of millions were on the move. Tens of thousands were armed with farm tools, pistols, looted rifles. A few thousand disciplined troops could save some lives, on some roads, on some days. They could not police a subcontinent convulsing. In his notebook, Thomas wrote, "We conquered this land with regiments and treaties over a century. We are leaving it with a few battalions spread thinner than butter." Partition is not a solution, it is a schedule. August 15th, 1947. Flags that marked an ending and an evasion. In Delhi, Mountbatten stood beside Jawaharlal Nehru as India's tricolour was raised over the Viceroy's house. Speeches were made about democracy, friendship, the orderly end of British rule. Radio carried Nehru's words, "At the stroke of the midnight hour when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom." In cantonments across the country, British units formed up. The Union Jack was lowered with ceremony. Bands played "God Save the King." Men stood to attention, some with lumps in their throats, others impatient to board ships home. Thomas watched the flag come down over his camp, then the new one go up over a nearby government building. There was no enemy artillery, no white flags from a defeated foe. Officially, this was not surrender. It was transfer of power. Unofficially, every man in that parade knew that an empire that had once dictated terms to continents was now leaving because it could not afford, politically or financially, to stay. He thought of the Japanese soldiers he had faced in Burma, fighting to the last bunker. He thought of German officers signing unconditional surrender in schoolhouses. Britain would undergo none of that humiliation. Its humiliation was quieter. Files marked top secret, carried to bonfires in back courtyards. Union Jacks folded into trunks. Street names changed overnight. The Empire's narrative would portray this as wise statesmanship. But in the notebooks of sergeants and privates, another story emerged. We were beaten not by bullets, but by numbers and time. We could not kill everyone into obedience. We did not dare try. And so we went. Aftermath. Veterans of a war no one named. When Thomas returned to Britain in 1948, he joined the same long queues as other demobilized men. Employers understood North Africa, Italy, Normandy. They asked about Anzio, Arnhem. They rarely asked about Bombay, Lahore, Calcutta. Officially, he had not fought a war in India. He had served in support of civil power. He married, found work in a factory, later in a garage. On Remembrance Day, he pinned on his Burma star. Sometimes someone would ask, "Where else did you serve?" "India," he answered. "Ah," they would say vaguely. "Keeping the natives in line?" He did not know how to compress into a pub conversation the experience of guarding warehouses in a city at war with itself, salvaging corpses from trains, standing on a roadside watching two columns of refugees pass each other in opposite directions, each convinced they were heading to safety, neither understanding the full cost ahead. Historians would later write about the transfer of power, the end of the Raj, the birth of India and Pakistan. Politicians would argue about whether Britain had left too early or too late. For him, the key realization was simpler and more unsettling. In his youth, he had believed that superiority in weapons, discipline, industrial capacity, could enforce any political project given enough will. In India, he saw that a population that will no longer cooperate, a home government that cannot stomach mass killing, a treasury that cannot fund limitless garrisons, add up to a defeat that looks, on paper, like an honorable withdrawal. In old age, he watched newsreels of other empires unraveling: French Algeria, Portuguese Angola and Mozambique, Americans in Vietnam. He recognized the pattern, not of military collapse, but of political evaporation. The enemy changed names and flags. The mathematics did not. He opened his old notebook one last time. At the top of the page, dated January 1947, he had once scrawled, "We beat the Jews. How can we be losing in a place where no one is shooting at us?" Underneath, in a shakier hand decades later, he added, "Because empire is not lost on battlefields alone. Sometimes it is lost in the minds of those who no longer believe they have the right to rule, and in the refusal of the ruled to pretend they believe it either." The British Empire did not die in a single day or from a single defeat. For soldiers like Sergeant Thomas H., it died on sweaty docks, in burning bazaars, at railway sidings where no order to fire could turn back the tide of people walking away from imperial history. The last victory of the Raj was to leave without calling it a defeat. The last lesson for the men who served it was that power measured in rifles and artillery is meaningless if the world and your own conscience no longer accepts the reasons to use them.